Bonjour, good morning. Welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to be here to speak with you today and share thoughts on building a world-class cybersecurity program for your OT environments, leveraging the SANS 5 critical controls. I'm just going to do a quick test to make sure clicker works, and I want to be conscious of time. So again, thank you and welcome. It's my pleasure to be able to speak with you today. My name is CHMILAR, and I am a Director of Professional Services for the North American region for Dragos. Dragos is an OT cybersecurity technology company that leverages threat intelligence, professional services, as well as a software platform to deliver comprehensive OT cybersecurity solutions to our customers in all industry verticals. For myself, I've spent 20 years in the OT cybersecurity space. A large portion of that was with Honeywell as a vendor, delivering OT cybersecurity solutions for our customers. And I've spent the last better part of a year and a half with Dragos, representing our professional services organization. We have so much to talk about today and so little time, so I will endeavor to be as brief as possible. But if you do have any questions, please feel free to find me afterwards and we can have a discussion. Now, I'm assuming most of you are at the black stage. We're here to talk about OT cybersecurity. I'm assuming that most are familiar with OT cybersecurity as a whole and the challenges that are part of that journey. But just in case there's anybody that's new to the conversation, just to frame up the key differences between IT and OT, think of OT as a system of systems responsible for physical processes. So the pumps, the actuators, the valves, the controllers that manage physical processes. OT cybersecurity focuses on providing the cybersecurity to ensure that those components can operate in a reliable and safe manner. You are often dealing with incredibly complex systems. A single site, for example, can entail multiple vendors. The standard life cycle for many of these systems is a decade or more, and the opportunity for upgrade or changes are limited to turnaround times or windows that are often once every year, once every 5 years, potentially even once every 10 years. So you have a disparity of technology, very long life cycle, incredibly complex systems. In addition to our standard hacktivists, cybercrime criminals, ransomware enthusiasts that are common threats to the IT environment, there are targeted threat groups that target ICS and OT environments specifically, and that is continually evolving. There are 3 threat groups that we at Dragos track, just to share some examples of the capabilities that are there. The first being Chernivite. We've tracked Chernivite since 2021. They are the first threat group to leverage PLC development environments to build a scalable framework that is usable across multiple platforms to exploit hundreds of PLC manufacturers. Xenotime we have tracked since 2014. Xenotime is, in our opinion, one of the most dangerous threat groups currently in existence today. They're the only threat group that has been known to specifically target an industrial process safety system, and they are responsible for the Triton exploit that happened in 2017. And lastly, Electrum. Electrum is a group that we have tracked since 2016. They are the first threat group that we have observed that has combined cyber warfare with physical warfare in their attacks against the Ukraine power grid. And lastly, when we think of it from an impact perspective, impacts to an OT cybersecurity event often result in concerns for human life safety, environmental impacts. If you're a wastewater treatment facility, for example, you want to be very concerned about what is getting into the drinking supply. And lastly, in addition to revenue and public image, that threat of the impact to human life safety and environmental impact cannot be ignored. So the 5 critical controls for cybersecurity were developed based off of the lessons learned from real-world scenarios, and they offer a flexible and adaptable vehicle for industrial companies to begin their ICS and OT cybersecurity journey. They are outcome-focused rather than being prescriptive in nature, which allows them to be flexible and adapted to any of the major standards that are in play today, whether it's ISA 62443, the NIST cybersecurity framework, etc. They prioritize rapid response capabilities And they offer a balanced approach into the detection and response capabilities, whereas the traditional standards and best practices that have been in play for the last better part of a decade have largely focused on preventative measures, implementing preventative security controls to, again, prevent cyber attack, while detection and response have had less of a focus. This offers that balanced approach in terms of preventative measures as well as detection and response. And lastly, because they are so grounded in risk management, they're easy to discuss at the executive level, and a lot of the messaging that can be delivered by OT cybersecurity teams are in terms that are understood at the executive level as well. So starting with the development of the first control, building an ICS-specific incident response plan. And because we haven't hammered it home enough over the better part of the last decade, shocker, ICS and IT are different systems and they need to be approached in different ways. The advantage that you have from an ICS incident response plan is that you can leverage existing enterprise-level incident response plans and then augment them to make sure that they factor in OT-specific response processes and scenarios to ensure that when an event does occur in an OT environment, you have the capability to respond. There's 2 steps that we advise organizations to take when looking at ICS-specific IR plans. Step 1 is to identify key scenarios that are a threat to you either as a vertical or as an organization. It's sufficient enough to start with 2 to 3, and as an example, every organization or every industrial company should include a scenario for an incident response to a ransomware event or to an insider threat event. Once you've identified those scenarios, shift your focus and look at things from a consequence-driven approach. What are the events that can have the highest impact to you as an organization, and what are the tools and capabilities that a cyber threat actor would need to leverage to exploit that type of event? With those 2 items factored in, you can begin to develop your OT-IR processes. And then lastly, once you have these processes developed, tabletop it. Execute a tabletop exercise to measure whether there's any residual gaps or any additional vulnerabilities or recommendations that can be identified as part of your development of this plan. Control number 2 focuses on creating a defensible architecture. So cybersecurity strategies often start with hardening of the environment, limiting ingress and egress, and identifying those data points where IT and OT are crossing boundaries, but it's much more of a nuanced conversation than that. A lot of people are drawn to network segmentation when they think of a defensible architecture. And network segmentation, while being very key, is only one factor. We have to consider the critical assets that are in operation with our OT environments. We call them crown jewels at Dragos. The data flows that are required to be shared between IT and OT, and the dependencies that IT and OT systems may have on the enterprise level. Those are all items that need to be considered when building a defensible architecture. And lastly, the most important component, the human factor in all this cannot be ignored. The adage that I've always used is that you are only secure as your least aware employee. So investment has to be made in awareness and training, in that a defensible architecture truly can become a defended architecture when the employees and the operators and staff understand their role in OT cybersecurity and are aware of the risks that are present to the organization. The third control, ICS visibility and monitoring, is often the most difficult, and it is often the control that has the most influence in all the other controls that are part of this package. Understanding your asset inventory, understanding the protocols and systems that are communicating within your network, and having visibility into those day-to-day baseline operations is key in inferring the scenarios that you develop as part of control 1, building the defensible architecture as part of control number 2, and it will infer and guide the implementation of controls 4 and 5. This is also the control where technology always becomes the question, and how can we use technology to solve this problem? There are a variety of vendors, Dragos included, that offer solutions from a technological aspect to address this issue, but we have to be sure that we communicate that there is no silver bullet when it comes to technology in this control. You need to consider the type of data that needs to be collected, the protocols and the vendors and the systems that are at play within your environment, as well as the resourcing requirements. Who's actually going to look at this data and action on it? Those are all key considerations to make when you are building a visibility program. And again, as I mentioned, it continues to be the biggest challenge that we see in our engagements. 80% of our engagements in 2022 had observations of limited to no visibility into an ICS or OT system. Control number 4, secure remote access. The advent of digitalization of control systems, as well as that increased interconnectivity between IT and OT, really has necessitated the need to allow remote access into IT or into OT environments. It's incredibly beneficial for an operator, a vendor, to be able to remotely connect, perform maintenance, respond to emergencies. So it's a great benefit, but it also carries some of the biggest risks. When approaching this security control, it's important to remember, in every case, multi-factor authentication should be a requirement in any secure remote access solution. Identify choke points or leverage network segmentation to require a breaking point in terms of moving from IT to OT remotely. There is a point where I need to authenticate to an independent system, a place where we can increase and enhance the monitoring capabilities and the logging capabilities that we have, and an opportunity to sever a remote connection that's independent of the enterprise or the OT environment are all things that need to be considered. The last thing, connections to vendors cannot be missed as well. It's incredibly important to allow vendors into the system, but you have to understand and remember that vendors that have remote access also expand the attack surface of your organization. You now have an entirely separate organization that has potential access into your system. So leverage the principles of least privilege, multi-factor authentication, and enhanced logging and control when it comes to secure remote access. And lastly, develop a risk-based vulnerability management program. Now, when we say vulnerability management, immediately thoughts turn towards patch management. And invariably, the attitude becomes patch everything, because that is what we've always done. That is simply not possible in an OT environment. As I mentioned before, you're dealing with legacy systems where availability is your primary concern, and it is not always technically feasible, nor possible, frankly, from a resource perspective, to patch everything. Adapting a risk-based vulnerability management program allows you as an organization to identify, again, those most critical components to your OT environment, the crown jewels, those critical assets and endpoints, and apply the necessary management program that includes an assessment of risk. So if we have areas that are low risk, low impact from a vulnerability perspective, we're not as concerned with patching those, or we may have compensating controls that we can consider to mitigate the risk. These are all components of a risk-based vulnerability management program, and it simply is not possible to have an attitude of patch everything. It is not realistic, it is not possible at all. So thinking of this from a journey perspective, a lot of the customers that I deal with are still relatively immature and beginning their OT cybersecurity journey. So as an idea as to where you could start, think of it from a crawl, walk, and run perspective. I'm not putting a timeline on any of this because it frankly is, it could be a 5-year program, it could be a 6-year program for you, depending on your organization. But from a crawl perspective, establish that baseline. Understand your asset inventory. Focus on those specific scenarios from an incident response perspective. And develop your incident response plans and test them. Moving on to the walk stage, look at the additional compensating security controls that you can operationalize and implement. Monitor your OT assets, build in a lot of that visibility, leverage technology where possible. Respond to IT or OT cyber threats as they occur. Capture lessons learned, update your IR plans. And lastly, from running, expand and mature. Shift your focus away from your highest impact assets and apply those controls to your medium and low impact assets and facilities as well. If possible, also integrate with your IT SOC or a threat intelligence group. So my wife's a teacher, and she wouldn't let me give a presentation without having some homework or further reading. So I've noticed some people with cameras out and screenshots. So if you are interested in further reading on this, I know I covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time. absolutely look at the SANS Institute. That is the actual white paper for these 5 critical controls. There's a lot of value there. The Dragos 2022 year-in report carries a lot of valuable detail, and there's a variety of white papers that we have published that address the implementation of a lot of these controls that I've discussed today. I want to thank you all so much for your time. If you have any questions, absolutely feel free to grab me afterwards. And I wish you a great day and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.